Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I know that people are still coming in. So anyway, my name is Emily Morrison. I'm the Executive Director of Studio Acting Conservatory. I'm really happy for everyone to be here tonight. I'm just going to say a quick couple of remarks. I was a student in the fall of 2019, studying the absurdist playwright Samuel Beckett with Joy Zinnemann, the teacher and founder of the Conservatory. She came in very excited one day with rather absurd news: the discovery of a major piece of artwork behind drywall. Now, if any of you know Joy, you know that when she gets excited about things, she kind of taps her feet and gets very animated, and all you want to do is be part of whatever it is that she is describing. If you don't know Joy, her enthusiasm is infectious. She told a story about receiving a text message from Deb Booth, who was the designer of this building, that included a picture of the sculpture and said, "Found behind drywall." And the response was, "Whoa, I'm coming over." And she told this story about then finding Akili's signature, which is over there in the corner, finding him, calling him, and visiting him that day. She showed us a couple pictures, and she said that you should all come over here and see this thing. So being a person infected by Joy's enthusiasm, someone who likes art, a person of faith, I came right over and found myself walking up the steps of this building, which at the time was greatly under extensive renovation. My first glimpse of the sculpture immediately brought tears to my eyes. I had no idea of the power and the enormity of it. Flash forward 2 years, and I'm the executive director of this organization. And now one of my favorite things to do is to bring people into this space, tell them to stand right about there, tell them a little bit of background, and then with a flourish, open that curtain and watch their faces. Why do I love this? Because the expressions that I see on people's faces when they see it for the first time is from awe to tears to disbelief. Like, that sound. The phrase "you have to see it to believe it" has taken on new meaning for me in this role. In acting, we strive to have an experience. And every time we show this sculpture, we capture someone else having an experience of great art. And it is an honor. And while our mission is to teach the craft of acting, we also have in our history thousands of years of theater as a sacred art, often tied to religious ceremony and practice. So it seems very natural that this sculpture be the backdrop for the study of theater. When we think about the uncovering of this sculpture, I think it's important to remember that in other hands, the Last Supper might have remained behind drywall. It might have been destroyed, or it might have been simply put behind a curtain. But Joy and the board of directors at the Studio Acting Conservatory knew that this piece needed to be seen and shared with the world. And we take our stewardship of this piece very seriously. And while it lives here at Studio Acting Conservatory, it really belongs to you, the public. It is a true honor to know Akili Ron Anderson and hear him speak about his work and his life. In talking about the rediscovery of this work, he has said, and this is not a direct quote, that it happened at the right time and when it was meant to. I believe that, and we are really glad to be part of making sure that his story gets told. I want to thank Teddy Reeves, curator of religion at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, for his devotion to this work and the meaning behind it. We're so grateful to be in partnership with NMAACH, and we share in their enthusiasm of the work. I want to thank Bakari Bird for her work programming the public viewing of this work, and also my staff. I'd also like to thank the good people at Humanities DC and the Weisberg Foundation for their support. And finally, thanks to the Board of Directors of Studio Acting Conservatory for their vision, to Joe Groff for documenting the events of discovery and restoration, and most notably to Joy Zinnemann, without whom none of this would be possible. And who, along with a designer, Deb Booth, is actually touring some of the great artworks of Europe at this moment and could not be here. So we're sad that she's not here. I'm going to turn this over to Teddy. I hope you have a wonderful evening in this sacred place, our home. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, thank you. Good evening. Oh, we can do better than that. Good evening. All right, it is a joy to be here. Again, my name is Teddy Reeves. I serve as the Curator of Religion in the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life. It's a long one, at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We are so excited to be here and so excited that this project is finally done, right? That is something to clap on. This is a pre-pandemic project that we started, or in pandemic. No, 2019. We were meeting in person. Pandemic steals time, right? And I will give a little background, and we're going to jump right into our evening panel, that Joy put on Facebook that this sculpture had been found, right? It landed in the Washingtonian, and this article is running and buzz is happening on Facebook that a Last Supper sculpture has been found in DC in an old church that is now in Studio Acting Conservatory. So I went on Facebook, I found Joy, and I saw people all over her messages, and I sent her a message, and I was like, I would love to have a conversation about what you all are going to do with this piece of art. So we came over here then. DeJuan Reese, who was our supervisor then and head of curatorial, was with us. Katrina Hill, who is no longer here, she transitioned to the ancestral realm from our team at the museum, and several other curators and conservators came to the space to try to figure out how could we actually take this piece of art and transport it to NMAACH. After several meetings, it was determined that our structure actually could not hold it at the museum. Our walls were not strong enough. And so it was decided to enter into a partnership with the Studio Acting Conservatory. So the museum stepped in to help in the conservation work. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later. So cleaning and restoring this beautiful work that Akili did, and also stepped in to talk about programming and interpretation of this work. So it is a project that we've been working on, and we're excited. A little later, in the other room in the middle, we'll spend a little time showing you the new digital exhibition that we just opened called Jesus' Hair Like Wool, which centers around the sculpture and the 3D imaging work that we did with the sculpture. So because we could not collect the physical thing, we 3D image scanned it. And so we have a 3D image of the sculpture in our collection, and we'll show you how you can play around with the sculpture and do some work with it in your own home a little later. But again, I'm grateful that you are here. We're excited that we get to celebrate this work. We get to celebrate Akili. I am all about giving people their flowers while they're still here. So if we can clap for Akili one more time for this amazing work. And I'm going to turn it over to my supervisor and Dr. Erica Galt, who's going to lead us into our evening conversation. And then followed by that, we're going to have some reflection time and some talking time. And then we'll have a brief presentation to talk about and show you the 3D scanning and some other things. Dr. Galt.
Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. It is a pleasure to be here for this unveiling of sorts, if you will. It is majestic and wonderful to be here to share it with you all this evening. As was said, my name is Erica Galt, and I have the awesome privilege of serving as the director for the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life. And in thinking about how we celebrate we thought of this conversation, which won't be long, but we thought it might be a good entry to this piece. Thank you. So I'll invite at this time our panelists who will join me in conversation. And once they're seated, I'll tell you who we have the illustrious pleasure of being in conversation with this evening. Joining me for the conversation, Aint or Aren't I a Woman? Black Women Messianic Figures in Black Religion is none other than Dr. Shively Smith in the middle, Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University. Dr. Regina Langley, to my far left here, is a social ethicist and independent curator of 19th and 20th century African American women's religious history. And Joy Chaney, who is the founder and principal of JOI Strategies and a studio acting conservatory alumni. Thank you for joining us. One of the questions that you might be wondering, and that has been asked, why this topic this evening? Why the move to women as we talk about Christ? And I think Sojourner Truth begins us well, and I'll read her quote here. She said, that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. I like that quote for this conversation. When we think about representations of the Messiah, and what better ground to think creatively about Christ than the experiences of Black women? We have sitting just behind us a piece that re-envisions how Christ is historically thought of. And so this conversation moves us even further and thinking about folks, women folk, who had the gall, the hubris, the oomph, as my grandmother would say, to envision Christ differently as well. I want to begin with you, Dr. Langley, given that your field is 19th and 20th century Black religious women, and thinking about Stuart Hall, who says the tell tells the teller. And so I'm wondering what this tells us about Black women. As you think about your research, how Black women have enlivened portraits of messianic figures, and also you hold a very special place in creating the digital exhibition and writing many of the exhibition labels. So this had to, in many ways, have been a very interesting experience for you. I wonder if you can talk about that a bit.
Yes, so when I think about Black messianic figures, I did my dissertation on Ida B. Wells. And so when you start to think about Black messianic figures, Black women embody, they're like the messianic figure incarnate, right? So Ida B. Wells was saying what modern day Black Lives Matter movement said. She was basically saying Black Lives Matter, like stop killing us, stop lynching us for mundane things, you know, like for being in public, for walking on the sidewalk, for sleeping on a bench or whatever. And then you start to think about a person like Nannie Helen Burroughs, who shifted the Baptist denomination and said, you know, Black women need their own space, right? And then so what she did was that she started a school for Black girls and said, I want Black women to be independent, I want them to be self-reliant, I want them to be leaders. And her 3 Bs, the broom, the bath, and the Bible. And so you start to think about these messianic figures, particularly for me at 19th and 20th century women, I'm always going to go and look at these women who push religious life forward. So, I mean, we could just name them all, like Mary Church Terrell, and I said Ida B. Wells, Nannie Helen Burroughs, Mary McLeod Bethune, you know, so that's kind of when I first saw this, I didn't see the women at the table. And so if we know anything about Black religious women's history, you know, the first Black woman was ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1940. And this church is, has a 200 and something year old history. So yeah, I'll just stop there.
Thank you, thank you. If we were to move a little further back and thinking about your field of research, Dr. Smith, around the New Testament, art often informs our view of the world as well, how we desire others to view us. We gather a sense, as Dr. Langley talks about, both of late 20th century Black DC in this work by Anderson, and 13th century Italy as well, how they view messianic figures. How might a womanist read of the New Testament add to or disrupt such views?
Yeah, I think the key word is sort of the womanist read. So a womanist read really comes to the New Testament text leveraging as an epistemology, a resource, Black women's experience, ways of knowing. I like to say ways of reading, right? And the third would be a ways of God consciousness. So when I think about how it reads alongside, a womanist way of reading the New Testament reads alongside or with the current of the New Testament, it is to see the women that are already there and obvious, right? It is to see Mary, the mother of Jesus, is to see Mary Magdalene, it is to see Elizabeth, it is to see, I mean, we could just keep running this list, the Samaritan woman at the well. It sees these women in the places where the text articulates it explicitly. Well, a womanist way of reading the Bible gets a little bit disruptive, right? And perhaps even challenging to interpretive ways of knowing when they read details that are implicit, unstated, perhaps omitted, I would say the other piece is unimagined. And so womanist ways of reading come to the New Testament text already with the sense that a God consciousness is already intact, which is a different way of engaging the New Testament than mainline traditions that typically go to the text and they extract the God consciousness from it. One of the resources of womanist reading to me is that you come to the text saying, what we're looking for here is content to express and articulate the God consciousness, the experiences and ways of being we already know to be most true. And so what happens when the biblical text becomes resource for imagining, for naming and explaining what already is? It opens up a well of possibilities. You actually read one of the disruptive examples from this period. So Sojourner Truth's use of naming Jesus' mother as more involved in the birthing moment is something that's actually getting picked up now when you think of a contemporary writer such as co-author Riley's This Here Flesh, where she names in a very similar way Mary's mother as the first suffering person in the crucifixion, right? To back up and say what is unstated is that blood was already shed for Jesus to get here. And so what do we do when we see a figure such as Mary as the first crucifixion, as the first loss of blood, the first shedding of blood, so life can come, that blood will be shed again, and then life will happen again. That's a womanist way of reading, seeing the cycles of life as integrated into the biblical text. I'll leave it there.
It also plays with the timeline, doesn't it?
It does.
If we don't go directly to the crucifix to talk about that blood, then we can't go only to the Last Supper to think about who is present in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, so womanist ways of reading the biblical text have actually been very defiant to the idea of this Pauline death and resurrection stream. I mean, that's really Paul when you think of something like 1 Corinthians 15. Womanist ways of reading go to the gospel and they start at birth, right? The creation, if we go to John 1, in the beginning was the word. We're going to go all the way to the matter of creation and birth. And then reads the text for the fullness of Jesus' life and ministry, which is another characteristic of a womanist way, a Black woman's way of reading, which is to appreciate the full embodiment that is expressed in the biblical text, that is also a witness to their own revelation of God and lived experience, I would say, in the divine.
So you move us forward and back in some ways, both what is in the text, and I like this idea of seeing, and figuring out how to place oneself in such a way that you can be seen. I want to bring you into this conversation, Joy, and moving to the contemporary and thinking about what does this mean for how Black women, Black folks, oppressed folks, the kind of folks that are sitting around this table here, might envision not so much solutions, but new imaginations or new ways of being. Your work around art and policy is significant. I wonder what you think about this contemporary moment and what this might say for us.
So I work actually at the intersection of race and gender. My public policy practice is all about that. I'm a lawyer by training, and I, came to studio to study acting for some fun. And I picked up my husband, who is one of the board chairs here. So first of all, it's really an honor to be here and in front of this piece. And I've seen Studio Acting Conservatory come a long way. To be here in front of this is a grounding that we did not have previously. So what I would say, when I come to mind and I think of this, and I love this, so this is not a knock, but I think about who's missing, like you all did, and how often women are missing from the story. And in preparation for today, I actually went to your website, and I was like, Black female Messianic characters, who is listed? And on the Smithsonian's website, not one woman is listed. So Marcus Garvey is listed, and Martin Luther King is listed. I don't even think Malcolm X is listed, which I think is interesting. I'll go back and check, but I was like, he's not there. I was like, wait a minute. But there were no women. There was no Mary McLeod Bethune. There was no Sojourner Truth. And that is not knocking you. It's just something to think about. Yeah. We have a grounding of who should be in the picture, and women are left out of that. Like I said, I work at the intersection of race and gender, and when I used to work at a civil rights org, one of the things I would have to remind folks are that Black people, women are Black people too. So when we work on gender policy issues, we are actually working on racial justice issues. And when you see if I would say the major movement leaders of recent era, Black Lives Matter is led by Black women, Black queer women to be exact. Tarana Burke is the leader of the Me Too movement. Fatima Goss-Graves, the head of the National Women's Law Center, is the leader of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. And who coined the word Time's Up? Oprah Winfrey. These are all huge Black leaders that if we were creating something like this for us, they would have their faces around that table, and ways in which we have to insert ourselves into the history. And at some point, I would love to also talk about how we make sure that our art, and when we do the intersection of art and policy, how our art is protected. The idea that this could have been covered up for so long, it's a crime, really, and a failure of imagination for what is valuable. How many Black people are covered up? And we are in this era where people are seeing us. But here I would say, Joy Zinnemann had the foresight, it saw it and recognized what we had here. But it's very likely that it could have been someone else who didn't see it and would have left it covered up. And I wonder sometimes if it had been a Black church who had discovered it, would it have gained the same lift that it did when this white woman posted it on her Facebook page? What if you had posted it? Well, maybe not you, you're at the Smithsonian, but someone else. I wonder. So at any rate, when I think about the intersections of art and policy, I think about all of the public policy matters where our, economics are put at peril, where our voice is silenced, where our face are completely wiped off the playing field.
Yeah. I wonder if others, I saw some head nods and.
Yeah,
you're talking about this.
yeah, because I was just thinking as you were talking about, when I said that, these black women embody the messianic figure, these were women that were on the ground. Like, Ida B. Wells was out on the ground, and she was going into communities, collecting stories and asking people, because these people were wiped out. If you go to the museum down in Alabama, right, and you have all these people that were lynched, no names. Their names are not there, but they collected dirt, as a something to remember them. But Ida B. Wells was out in the community, Nanny Helen Burroughs, said, okay, we need to start a school because in the black church, they were raising all this money, but it wasn't for the women. So she's like, okay, we need to take money and raise money for the women. So when you start to think about the messianic figure is the person that's walking the ground, right? And so like I said, when I first saw the sculpture, I didn't see the women. But as I started to reimagine, that I could possibly, there might be a woman there. And then I was looking at the eyes, and I thought about Woodrow Nash, who did the sculptures at the Whitney Plantation, because he's like the eyes are the window to the soul. And so if black women are the women who are in the community seeing the stories and hearing the stories, and then so we have to hear what black women have to say so that we are not erased from the table.
Yeah. That is what is so disruptive
It's right.
about this piece, is that it opens up a field of imagination. If I can see Christ as a black man, I can see him as a black woman, as a queer woman, as so many others of us, we are seen and allowing ourselves to be seen in that way.
Yeah.
Can I say something about studio, since I'm the studio rep here today in a sense? The Shakespeare 2 class that Joy Zinnemann leads, anyone in here ever taken that? Yes. What's one of the most interesting things about that class? It allows us to disrupt Shakespeare, and different genders get to play different things. So a woman can be Hamlet, and a woman can be Macbeth, and a man can be Lady Macbeth. And that in and of itself is disruptive, and we do it very intentionally. After you've gotten to know the traditional, then you get to reimagine what that can look like, and you discover new things.
When I look at this piece of art and this way of talking about the Lord's Supper, there's a couple of things that stick out to me that are really important as I think about black women's interpretive work in the text, actually from the 19th century up to the present day. So I appreciate the fact that it has this 3D textured experience. So when I think about New Testament studies and the interactions with art that sort of dominate ahistorically, the imaginations of the Lord's Supper depictions that show up in people's mind that actually shape what they can and cannot see or imagine or do with the biblical texts versions, multiple versions of the Lord's Supper. One of the things that dominates typically, I would say, that discourse of interpretation between the Lord's Supper art and then the biblical text is a lot of times these are flat images, right? So if I ask a student to engage and tell me a piece of art that makes them think about Christ, Messiah, Lord's Supper, crucifixions, or they do this kind of work, they pick flat images that everyone knows, right? I love how this image makes that a textured conversation. It is a conversation that should not be flat, but it pops out of the space. And for me, I think about it as a modality of thinking about what the biblical text should be in the New Testament story of Lord's Supper and that whole Messiah and Christ landscape, horizon discourse there is, what does it mean to approach the text and see it as something that is textured, that should pop out from the page and disrupt space in new ways? How does that open up new ways of thinking? So I have an example, a sister from the 19th century. When I think of someone like Julia Foote, who ends up writing one of the, 3 really dominant spiritual autobiographies of Black women in the 19th century, she has this place where she makes a turn in her autobiography. She's fundamentally advocating for why women, but particularly a Black woman, should preach, right? And she ends up saying, so let's be clear, I'm going to paraphrase. She goes, so let's be clear, both women and men were in the upper room for the Pentecost. So she's talking about Acts 1:14. And both women and men received the Holy Ghost. So it's Holy Ghost, right? We're not even talking about Spirit, it's Holy Ghost, right? Receive the Holy Ghost, right? And then she'll say, and if the Spirit of the Holy Ghost has left the women, it has left the men too. And if there is no prophecy in the women, there is no prophecy in the men too. That's what I mean by texture that pops off the page. So when I look at it as a scholar, I go, well, this is going to sound very scholarly, what I'm getting ready to say. So, which means it's not, right? I'm going to say, well, she ain't wrong. Right? I don't see where the Spirit stops on anybody right there. So this piece for me inspires me to think about the power of not only what it means for us to create, using the content of the biblical text, which has been a resource for God consciousness, imagination for Black people interacting with the biblical text, but what it means to imagine even how we present our interpretations differently, the very media by which we engage in the interpretive act and what that media needs to do as we engage in it is fundamentally a rhetorical act of resistance. And that is a part of the inheritance of interpreting the New Testament text in these sort of moments that are really key in that story of Messiahship and the Lord's Supper that I really want to hold on to, I think.
I think that goes back as well to what you were saying about how we read it. And art does have its own text. That's right. And we see this through its textures here. Yeah. Well, we've almost come to the end of our time, if you can believe it. And I just have one final question for each of you. With a gaze toward the future in light of everything that you've mentioned here, let's say you're creating a Last Supper painting today. Who's at your table and why?
Well, everybody's going to get mad with me, but I don't, whatever. So, one of the first persons I would want at my table would be Dave Chappelle. Because Dave Chappelle has a philosophical humor to his art and his craft, right? And so he grapples with all of these issues of the day. So I was just watching the last couple of days, I just love Dave Chappelle. So the last couple of days I was going back and watching some of his stuff. I watched The Dreamer, and I love it, and I watched The Closer because it was so controversial. But Dave Chappelle is a serious thinker. And so he makes us grapple with what is happening in the culture. So as a public historian, I'm always asking the question, what is happening in the culture? So I would have Dave Chappelle, because sometimes when I think about women being left out, for me, it's laughable. It's just laughable. So comedy plays a major role sometimes in how I read the world. So I would have Dave Chappelle at my future table.
Awesome. Who is at the table with Dave Chappelle?
That's a woman, so I'm going to say a man. So.
I work in politics, so I'm going to say Michelle Obama a bit, but not because of the traditional reasons that people have. I don't think people ever listen to her. I think, first of all, we shared the same mentor, Charles Ogletree. I went to Harvard Law School, and he would always say, I taught both of them, and I thought I knew who might be president, and it wasn't Brock, right? And he's great, but she's brilliant, and if you have not listened to her, she is disruptive. I'll never forget, she was speaking at a panel and they were screaming, "You need to run for president." And she stopped and she said, "No, that's right there. That's your problem." She's like, "You're calling for me to run for president, but let me tell you what would happen if I ran for president. You would do me like you did Hillary Clinton. And you're not gonna have me out here." And you're like, you had a chance and you didn't do it, you failed. And she was so direct and so raw. And it's the way, and she wasn't angry. She just told them the truth. And she just told them the truth. And there was a moment where at the end of the 8 years, someone interrupted her and she stopped and she said, "I don't do this. It's not something I do well. So either you can talk or I can talk. But we can decide right now which one is." And everyone was like, "Get out of here. You talk, you talk, you talk." There's a different way that I think Black women talk, and a revolutionary way.
Yeah.
Even so listen to her next time. She has a lot to say about policy, about approach, about how we see one another, and about boundaries. So she would have to be on my list.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so I'm going to pick someone who is among the ancestral realm, but I think it's very important in grounding in DC, which would be Anna Julia Cooper for me. And so Anna Julia Cooper is so important, I think, to thinking about the DC context and what it means. I mean, so this becomes the woman whose quote is in the passport, right? This is a Black woman who fundamentally was dislocated and disregarded in this DC context, regarding education, and left and then returned again. And then she's my she wrote because she ends up getting did you know she ended up getting a PhD, y'all? And at 60 at the Sorbonne, right? So like I'm leaving this country to go get my degree. And then for me, she's a major interpreter of the biblical text. And so she would actually pick up on the Lord's Supper and crucifixion and some of her advocacy writings for the church. And I think she's a powerful person to sit at the table as someone who suffered the consequences of resistance, right? This inevitable crucifixion that comes, the moment we hit the Lord's Supper, we know we're heading to the consequences of disruption. And for me, she embodies that.
Wow. This table, I don't know if there'll be much sitting. This sounds like turning of the tables. It's possible. But they're at the right table with Jesus. Yes. So this has been wonderful. Thank you all so much for engaging me in conversation, and thank you for listening. Turn it back over to you, Doc.